Cody Groat, thank you so much for chatting with us. Indigenous issues have been absent throughout this federal campaign, quite different from when Justin Trudeau ran in previous elections. Can you explain what happens when these issues are not discussed?
I feel the number one part of the dialogue that we're hearing this election is sovereignty. And when we hear Canadian sovereignty really being promoted as the election issue, it in some ways by necessity erases this question of Indigenous sovereignty. And I think that's extremely problematic because that's where we've been making headway in a lot of these conversations, is recognizing us as sovereign nations. And when we focus on that Canadian nationalism and that Canadian sovereignty, the dialogue shifts, and that's going to shift every associated issue that relates to Indigenous peoples in this country.
Cody, are you a bit worried that because these Indigenous issues are not being talked about enough in this campaign, does that mean Indigenous issues will not be important when Parliament resumes after the election, no matter who wins?
I think that's a really valid question. And if you look at both the Liberal and Conservative parties, which have now released their platforms, you see that there is quite an absence in anything in relation to Indigenous peoples. The Conservative platform, which came out April 22nd, has conversation and language about our Indigenous peoples, which seems to me a little bit antiquated from what we've seen in recent dialogue. We've also seen the Conservative Party trying to shift the language and the funding towards sole and individual First Nations governance. I think there's some value in that, but I think it's also trying to alleviate some of the federal government's responsibilities, that nation-to-nation, crown-to-nation relationships. So I think we have to be careful of some of that language and how it's being introduced. When it comes to the Liberal platform, I'm surprised to see some of the policy planks that they're acting on. For example, expanding reserve lands and expanding reserve territories is included in the Liberal platform. So I think that we're not seeing it as discussed as I think it needs to be. We're seeing in the platforms, in some platforms it is really not mentioned at all. In other platforms it is there to an extent, but the dialogue definitely is not reflecting the concerns that need to be addressed.
Cody, what are some Indigenous topics you think party leaders should be talking about right now?
I think obviously the dialogue of reconciliation, we're at 10 years to the TRC in 2025, so we're going to be acknowledging that 10-year anniversary in the coming weeks and months. And I think one thing that we need to recognize is how the majority of the calls to action have not been addressed. We have calls to justice from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls National Inquiry. Again, those have not been addressed. So I think when we have this general dialogue about reconciliation that federal governments like to act upon, we also have very clear and tangible actions that have been requested over the years. And we're not acting upon those. We've not seen those acted upon. So when we acknowledge the 10th anniversary of the TRC, we also have to recognize there's a lot of work that needs to be put in that's not been done yet.
Vancouver Island Conservative candidate Aaron Gunn, whose social media posts against Indigenous people have sparked a lot of controversy, Pierre Poilievre has decided to stand by him. Should Indigenous people be worried about this?
I think they should be. I think one thing that we're seeing is the federal Conservative Party is trying to fit a lot of different interests into the same party tent. I think we're probably seeing some fractures in that tent now, where we're seeing perhaps more of a progressive conservative wing trying to fight against this more socially conservative wing. But Pierre is trying to cater to that socially conservative wing, which is using this rhetoric that is anti-Indigenous, residential school denialist, some of that language. So again, perhaps it won't reflect the actions of the government if it were to be elected, but the fact that the federal party leader is catering to that rhetoric is definitely concerning.
Finally, Cody, do you think Indigenous people will make their voices heard in this election? And is there a lot at stake here?
One thing that we often see is we see some reserve communities or some First Nations saying that, this is a foreign election. This is a national government that is not our sovereign nations. So we see some First Nations denying Elections Canada from having polling places within reserve lands and within reserve territories. I think that's entirely valid. And again, we're seeing this rhetoric of Canadian sovereignty being really pushed this election, and that's minimizing this language and rhetoric of Indigenous sovereignty. So in my opinion, we're probably going to see consistent voting turnout from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities compared to other elections. But as we know, that's been historically low for a number of reasons.
Cody Groat is the assistant professor with the Western University in Ontario. Cody, thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you for having me.